Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Higgins, and thank you all for coming. I love to come to Canada. It's one of my very favorite countries. Even though I don't completely understand your politics, nonetheless, I hope that you're more satisfied with your election than we are, many of us are in the United States. Before we get into all of this serious, heavy stuff, let me tell you about a little joke that's going around in Washington about the Holy Father, that he just celebrated his 10th anniversary. And according to the story, the Holy Father was talking to God and praying, asking him how he's done in these 10 years. And so the Holy Father, according to the story, talks to God, and he said, well, Holy Father, oh Lord, will there be married priests in my lifetime? And the Lord answered very quickly, no, not in your lifetime. And the Pope felt a little better about this. And then the Polish Pope says to God, well, will there be women priests in my lifetime? And the Lord said quite quickly, no, not in your lifetime. And the Polish Pope was greatly encouraged now. And the Polish Pope said, well, will there be another Polish Pope? And the Lord said very promptly, not in my lifetime. I was reading a funny book the other day by Congressman Mo Udall. He ran for governor, he ran for president, and didn't quite make it. He lost in the primaries to Jimmy Carter. And so he wrote a book called Too Funny to Be President. And one of the stories that he tells is this, that he said, when I die, I want to be buried in Chicago so that I can remain politically active. If you don't get that, that's an American joke about Chicago. Mo Udall also has a very pleasant little quip about what he alleges happened in my election. And he said that up in Massachusetts, Father Drinan used to run for Congress, and they used to have bumper stickers saying, vote for Drinan or go to hell. I want to talk with you, my dear friends, and then we have a discussion period where I'll be happy to talk about the American election and that what, in my judgment, happened with the arrival in the Oval Office of George Bush. But I want to talk about the church in America and something about the emerging crisis that we see now because of the lack of personnel and the ambiguity of our position, and something about what Catholics think, obviously, about politics. And then also, and most importantly, what is the future for all of us? I wish indeed we had more associations between the Catholics of Canada and the United States. I read diligently all about you. Unfortunately, the American press doesn't tell us enough about this wonderful country. With your election was covered rather well, but we'll go back to a desert of not enough news about your country. Let me talk, if you will, about the Catholic Church in America that I grew up in prior to Vatican II. This was a church made up of immigrants. 52 million immigrants came during the 2 centuries of America's existence, and now that population is up to 240 million, of which 23%, or about 54 million people, are Roman Catholics. This is an extraordinary thing, where these people came from all of these diverse lands and transferred their faith. And back in the 60s, at the top of the vibrancy prior to Vatican II, we had almost 5 million children in Catholic schools. That's every 50% of all the children. And as you know, in the United States, there's no subsidies whatsoever for church-related schools of less than collegiate rank. And during that same period, some 300 colleges built up and thousands of high schools and grade schools. And that, obviously, that was one of the great achievements, really, in the history of the church, that should have been done. We're all very familiar with your splendid schools. That's a somewhat different tradition, and that it is a great achievement. But I'm familiar with a Catholic grade school that I went to in the United States, and that we welcome particularly the presidency of John Kennedy. We're remembering that now 25 years after the assassination, and we tend to look back and look at that era when the nuns had these very, very European habits. 180,000 nuns, and that's now down to about 100,000. There were 65,000 priests at the height of the old church, and that's now down to 50,000. There's still 3 million kids in Catholic schools, and I don't mean to say that all of this has faded away, but as a Jesuit, we're very apprehensive about our own future in America. We have 28 colleges and 42 high schools. We were very, very proud last year that we celebrated the presence of the millionth graduate, living graduate, of all the 28 Jesuit colleges and universities. and we look back with a certain triumphalism and say it was an extraordinary achievement that we should have had that. But now we have fear and foreboding about the future, and we look back and we wonder in our conscience, have we committed some serious sins of judgment? Were we too rigid? Were we too superficial? Were we too repressive of all of these individual aspirations? And we're doing that a lot now in the 25th anniversary of the beginning of Vatican II in 1963. Lots of people, millions, have been in open rejection of the Church since Vatican II, and in all candor, we don't quite understand it. Some of the old folks, at least a minority, still want the Latin Mass and the Rosary and novenas and nuns and habits and all of those things that were the silent church of the old days. And there's a new generation coming up, and I teach them every day, and they've never known the church prior to Vatican II, and they have seen the chaos, if you will, and the disorder of the world after Vatican II, and that millions of these young people have dropped out, and frankly, I'm not certain where they will be with regard to the Catholic Church in another 10 or 20 years. So we look back at this great revolution, and we wonder more and more where all of this is taking us, and that all we can say is that the church is changing very radically. Right now, the church is the most educated of any group in the United States. And this is an extraordinary achievement, that the Catholics of America are more educated than any Protestant group and probably more than most Jewish groups. This does not apply, of course, to all of the Hispanics, who are 10 or 12 million in the Catholic Church, the non-Cuban Hispanics. But this is an extraordinary achievement where in a period of 100 years or far less, all of a sudden you have 54 million Roman Catholics in America who are the most educated group in that country. And so I turn my attention to what the 300 Catholic bishops have been doing. They also have attained a new maturity. These are not old-fashioned bishops whose names you hardly ever knew. These are men who lived during Vatican II as priests or seminarians. They tend to be cautious and careful, especially under this Pope, but that they do have an enormous influence. And in 1981, they began a new life among themselves. And in that year, Mr. Reagan came to the White House, and that he said that nuclear war was thinkable and indeed winnable. He had the rhetoric about the evil empire. He was determined to double the defense budget, and he said that I am not going to enforce SALT II, and that I am going to continue testing nuclear weapons under the ground, something that every president had wanted to do, phase out those nuclear test weapons. And also Mr. Reagan said we're going to revive the production of biological and chemical warfare. And the Catholic bishops were really appalled at this. Why? Because the Catholic bishops, a very conservative group in some issues, they had testified in 1979 in favor of the ratification of SALT II. And indeed, it was Cardinal Crowell, one of the most conservative, the former Archbishop of Philadelphia, who went and testified on behalf of the 300 Catholic bishops. Then they saw a man in 1981 come into the White House that was opposed to some of the very essential things that the Catholic bishops had endorsed, for which they had received some criticism. And as a result, they said in 1981, we have to make it clear to this country what we stand for with respect to war and peace. Vatican II, they recall, was very clear. Vatican II said categorically in 3,500 words about war, nuclear weapons may never be used offensively or defensively. They may be retained under certain circumstances for the purpose of deterrence, but they may be retained only if there is a clear understanding that they are going to be phased out in the relatively near future. That was totally understood by the Catholic bishops, and that's why in 1981 they began their first of the three famous drafts on their pastoral on nuclear war. They did it in a democratic fashion, something that bishops don't always follow. And they went to all types of people around the country. They had hearings, and eventually they produced the third draft, and where they said, as did the Canadian bishops around the same time, that nuclear weapons may never be used except possibly a small, tiny neutron bomb for strategic reasons, but that the continued possession of these weapons is strictly conditioned. Once again, they go back to Vatican II, and once again, some nuclear pacifists were somewhat disappointed. They didn't condemn the use and the possession of the nuclear weapon, but they did say in this extraordinary document adopted 5 years ago, there should be no testing of nuclear weapons under the ground. There should be no resumption of biological or chemical weapons. Star Wars, and this came a bit later, Star Wars fathered by President Reagan in 1983 should be condemned, and that they hold to the unratified SALT. And they likewise want to hold to the ABM Treaty and they do not want it violated, as they said it would be, by Star Wars or the SDI. Suddenly, all of a sudden, the 300 Catholic bishops are a major player in the nuclear arms race. And frankly, all of us were really thrilled to see the Catholic Church, almost for the first time in its history in the United States, taking a strong position on a complicated matter, consulting the laity, consulting non-Catholics. One of the great thrills was to have the National Council of Churches, which represents all mainline Protestant bodies, come forth spontaneously and adopt and endorse the reasoning and the result of the pastoral of the Catholic bishops. You can't imagine what a triumph that was, because the Protestants and the Catholics had had all their differences, and that even after Vatican II there was strong hostility and animosity even. And now you have the whole of the churches, the Catholics, 54 million, 70 million mainline Protestants coming together and saying, we are totally opposed to the basic formation of our foreign policy. Virtually all Jewish groups came along. And as a result, starting in 1983, you had a whole new coalition in America, namely the churches opposing some of the basic fundamentals of the public foreign policy of the United States. I recall vividly some of the things that the Catholic bishops did to educate their people and popularize this. I remember particularly vividly going to Iowa for the Bishop of Des Moines, and from Thursday night to Monday morning we went to 17 different places in this rural diocese, talking about the pastoral with the bishop there, having a lot of instructional material, then praying for peace. And I know that this made a great, great impact. And one of the thrilling things was that a year or two after this was finally released in 1983 and approved by the bishops with only 8 dissents, the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago made a survey of Catholic attitudes, and they discovered that there had been a 30% shift in the opinion of Catholics everywhere in America towards what the bishops had been saying, and that was not replicated among non-Catholics. We look out at what has happened in the last 5 years, and that something extraordinary has happened in the Catholic community. The hierarchies of France, West Germany, Australia, Belgium, and other nations have come forward and put out pastorals emulating what the Catholic bishops did, and I praise the Canadian hierarchy and everybody who worked with them, because the Canadian statement is one of the most sophisticated and nuanced that exist. It may be a bit more militant for the pacifist side, if you will, than the Catholic hierarchy. Some people wanted to say, there's basic differences, and that the French actually would approve the use of the nuclear weapon in some circumstances, but that's really untrue. Why? Because the Monsignor who wrote that statement for the Catholic bishops said, in essence, he agrees with the Catholic bishops going back to Vatican II. Is this an historic moment? Well, I think it certainly is, and that we'd love to see more visible results. We'd love to be able to demonstrate that this has had this particular effect on the foreign policy. Maybe some years from now we'll see that, but that it was historic that the Catholic Church joined the controversy, that Cardinal Bernardine, who chaired the committee that wrote this, was on national television and on the cover of Time, and that the Catholics have entered into a situation where they never were present before. Looking back, however, we have to ask ourselves, were Catholics influenced? I don't know. It's very hard to measure this. I do know that 54% of the Catholics voted for Mr. Reagan in 1984, and Mr. Reagan, with all due respect, never came along on any of these things. And 51% of the Catholics voted for George Bush 2 weeks ago, and that I'm not saying that they don't follow the encyclical or the pastoral, but that I wonder whether they failed to know or whether they knowingly rejected what the bishops have said. We expect some hard right, far right sentiments, and we had them with Bill Buckley and with vehement anti-communists, and that a few of them went to the absurd suggestion that, the communists have infiltrated the Catholic bishops. But generally, they don't want Catholic bishops to be doing this. They want to get back to the age when Catholic bishops confirmed my child, and you hardly knew his name, and that he went away and he never got into the papers. There's a lot of sentiment like that in the United States from old-fashioned Catholics. However, I think that we don't have any real resistance to what the hierarchy says in the main line. but do they really defend it? Some people have defended it, and other people are indifferent to it. And Cardinal Bernardine recognized the very strong power, moral power, in the pro-life movement, and that he tried to devise, he did devise what he calls the seamless web. And he said that Catholics are on the side of life. We are opposed to abortion. We are opposed to the use of nuclear weapons under any circumstances. And we are opposed to the death penalty. And he announced the seamless web at Georgetown University many moons ago, and that it has it has received a good deal of publicity in the Catholic community, but I'm not certain really that it's selling with everybody. Congressman Henry Hyde, for example, a conservative Catholic Republican from Chicago, said that I am against abortion, but I'm for nuclear weapons, and I'm for the death penalty. And that one group in America over the last year has done something that I think is very commendable. They have tried to enlist the support of officials, public officials, and also laity and clergy who would in fact endorse the seamless web. They are opposed to abortion, they deplore the death penalty, and they want nuclear weapons to be phased out. That group had some ads in the newspaper during the election. I don't know how important it is, but that I do think that this is the central issue of strategy and public morality now. The Catholics are not in favor of the recriminalization of abortion. On every single listing and poll, Catholics are almost identical with non-Catholics. They're opposed to abortion from Catholic tradition, 60-40 or better, and that they are also opposed to the recriminalization. And as a result, if Roe v. Wade, which allowed abortion by the Supreme Court ruling in 73, if that's qualified or even reversed, Catholics are going to be deeply divided. There'll be a pro-life group, and that there'll be a pro-choice group, and that will this deter from the ongoing debate and discussion on the nuclear weapons? I am not certain, but I'm certain that the Catholic bishops in America probably will be very hard-line, and they will take the position probably that we want abortion recriminalized, and they may be on the wrong side of history if they do that. Is the Catholic Church in America becoming a peace church? Well, not exactly. However, 40 of the 300 bishops do belong to Pax Christi, which is a pacifist group. Bishop Gumbledon of Detroit heads it. And that I do feel that there's a good deal of movement in the church towards the position of Archbishop Hundhausen, who is opposed to all of this. He likes the pastoral, but he would go beyond the pastoral. So, my dear friends, I talk and write about this because I see the spirit of parliamentaries working in the Catholic Church. Some of you are old enough to remember on Easter Sunday, 1963, that beautiful man, Pope John the 23rd, issued one of his most powerful encyclicals, Parliamentaries. This is just before Vatican II, and Pope John almost stated that nuclear weapons don't make sense, and that, in fact, war doesn't make sense anymore. He almost stated that there can't be anything like the old Catholic definition of a just war. And that is in the souls, if you will, of Catholics, and that we deplore Nagasaki. And as a Christian and as an American, I apologize to the entire world that the United States is the only country that ever deployed the nuclear weapon at Nagasaki. And I pray regularly that the United States never employ it again. And I am ashamed at this platform, at this beautiful university, to say that my nation still has 30,000 nuclear weapons in its arsenal, that it manufactures 3 more nuclear weapons every day, 1,300 every year. And it seems to me that the church in America knows this. The bishops clearly saw it. The bishops had their moment of publicity, and that some people say this is the Catholic moment when we have to move forward and educate people. However, this particular moment is one of ambiguity. Probably everybody in Canada and in the world was startled when Margaret Thatcher said that the Cold War is over. I don't think George Bush is going to say that. I don't know what George Bush will do. In my little judgment, he has no real basic moral policies in this area. He has gone with SDI and Star Wars and with anything that Ronald Reagan wants. And that's why this particular moment is most important for American Catholics, because this man is susceptible to whatever public opinion says is advantageous to George Bush. This is a great moment of grace, and that we are not confronting totally another Reagan administration. Some people say that this is the Catholic moment in history, and that we are so influential in the United States. And I think the bishops recognize that. and the bishops met recently in Washington for their annual meeting in late November, and I think a lot of them had the feeling that why don't we say something that is dramatic? Why don't we re-emphasize all of these things? They know that Reverend Falwell and other people are losing their mind almost, that we don't hate the communists like we used to, and that they know that there are forces of ambiguity and doubt. Well, let me come to a second major initiative that the Catholic bishops have done, namely their pastoral on the economy and a just society. Archbishop Weakland, who chaired the evolution of this particular document, is an extraordinary man, now the Archbishop of Milwaukee, but he was the world head of the Benedictines. He was a child of the Depression, growing up with 4 siblings, with a widowed mother in Pennsylvania, and he tells in all of his testimony about this area how his mother was humiliated, there was no such thing as social services, and he is determined in America to do everything that he can that such situations like that are never replicated for the children of today or tomorrow. And so in this extraordinarily good document that they released about a year ago, they echo Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno. They go back to the preferential option for the poor. They recite what the Catholic bishops of Latin America said at Medellin, at Puebla, and that they put out a document that made me, as a Catholic lawyer, proud. Here is a sophisticated statement that's neither for socialism nor for unregulated capitalism. They deplored 35 million poor people in America. In the richest nation in the history of the world, the number of poor people is still increasing, and now every 5th child in America lives under the poverty line, especially black children, and that there is a moderate tone to this particular letter, but they are clearly opposed to what has happened in the last 8 years, trickle down and laissez-faire. And obviously a very strong, rich group of Catholics came out opposed to this particular letter. And William Simon, a Catholic of note with a good deal of wealth, paid to have a similar statement from his point of view put out, and they sent it to every priest in the country, and they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of the capitalist money. And the bishops were a bit pained at this because these were all Catholics doing this thing, but that the Catholic bishops have remained firm, receiving a lot of flack, clear opposition from the Wall Street Journal, a lot of dissent from the right in the church, and once again millions of Catholics saying, bishops shouldn't be doing this at all. Just baptize and confirm my kid, and that's all we want from you. So that whole idea of the church as belonging in the sacristy still persists. But that the pastoral, once again, I think is going to last, and that it is a document that's studied in all the Catholic schools, that is quoted from time to time in the secular press, and that I think it's going to have, or continue to have, a very strong impact. And once again, it means that Catholics around the world look to this document and that they echo it. Let me come to a third pastoral where the bishops have been, I think, less successful. I don't know whether anybody could be successful in writing a pastoral about women. Some women, before the bishops issued their statement about a year ago, their tentative preliminary statement, some women said, please, bishops, don't write a statement. We don't want a statement about women coming from celibate men. But that they admit, for openness, that it's a very hard situation. The church is opposed to birth control, abortion, divorce, and the ordination of women. So what can you do to make women think more highly of the church? The Holy Father just recently, as you know, put out a reflection on women, 115 pages, and in many ways it's plausible that the America magazine, edited by the Jesuits in New York, had an article about it, and they rather justified this and said that it is plausible and persuasive. However, the Catholic bishops in America have other problems. They did not endorse the Equal Rights Amendment, to the disappointment of millions of women, and really without a plausible explanation to anybody. And that the bishops do try to involve women in some programs in the U.S. Catholic Church, but women in America who are Catholics feel left out, and they feel that something is wrong, and that they know that the novitiates of the religious orders are empty. 80,000 nuns have left. The economic situation of the older nuns who are retired is almost deplorable. And Monsignor George Higgins the other day, a noted commentator on American life, said that the Catholic Church is going to lose millions of women if it doesn't alter or clarify its position on women. They will lose millions, just like the Catholic Church lost millions of workers in the 19th century when the Catholic Church did not put forth some document about the rights of workers. The pastoral of the bishop is now, the bishops on women is now in its second or third draft, and they're seeking to improve the last draft. They've consulted with all types of women. They were very sensitive, it seems to me, to the aspirations of women. They received some flack once again on the right, saying, you just went to all of those far left kooky women. And that the Catholic bishops have a very, very difficult situation. Why? Because the position of women has changed more in the last 20 years than it had in the previous 20 centuries. And the Catholic Church is trying to catch up with working women and all of the emancipation and the revolutions. International law is far ahead of the Catholic Church. I published an article a couple of weeks ago in America magazine on CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, ratified by the United Nations 8 years ago, now adopted in 90 nations of the earth, and it is now a part of customary international law. The United States has not ratified that. Most major nations, including many Catholic nations, have ratified that, and this gives rights to women now in international law that they do not have in the United States of America. The Pope did his best in 110 pages. He obviously knows that this is one of the key neuralgic points in the Catholic Church today. What are we going to say about the position of women? And he wrote this response, if you will. He wrote a personal reflection on the dignity and vocation of women, and this was released to the world on September 30 of this year. He said that all men and women share in the priesthood of the faithful. The Holy Father expands on the complete equality in God's plan for men and women, and that he has a rich explanation how men and women have always been basically, essentially the same. Then he comes on in section 26 out of 31 sections to give a 2.5-page explanation of why women may not be ordained. And he says that Christ chose men not to conform to the prevailing customs, but to teach us that he wants only men to be ordained. Is that going to sustain the path of history? As you know, the Anglicans have a hard time on this issue. The Jewish people are divided. I don't know what the future of that document is. All I know that in the United States, where women have more freedom possibly than most places in the world, the Catholic bishops and the Catholic Church is seeking very, very diligently to somehow bring the Catholic Church to meet their aspirations. Well, all three of these pastorals recognize and pound away at the fact that Catholics in America have an enormous responsibility to the entire world. And maybe Catholics, maybe Americans have some type of a world dream that others, that they shouldn't have. And maybe they pontificate, maybe they're super nationalistic. But the fact is that America, the United States, has a power simply because of its wealth and because of all of its decadence. The United States has only 5% population of the earth. They use over 40% of the resources, and that they have enormous power to change the way in which people live. We look out at the world as Christians and ask ourselves what's going to happen in the next 11 years before the year 2000. Unbelievable things are going to happen that are uncontrollable. 1.2 billion new human beings will be born into the global village. That means that the population will go from 5 billion human beings to 6.2 billion in the next 11 or 12 years. There's no planning for that at all. No one could pretend that we really are happy to have these fellow brothers and sisters. And in the United States, I'm ashamed to say, there's not even any knowledge of that particular explosive fact. There's 800 million tonight who are chronically malnourished. There are 40,000 children who died today, and another 40,000 children will die tomorrow from preventable causes of malnutrition. Millions of children in the third world do not get the basic vaccines that every child in Canada gets, despite all of the efforts of UNICEF to bring these vaccinations to all of the children of the earth. There are 600 million people, mostly children and women, who are illiterate, and the number of people who cannot read or write is not diminishing, it is increasing. Look at the specters that we have facing us in the future. And as people living in rich North America and as Christians, we have to say these are our problems. Tiny little Bangladesh that has suffered so much recently from the floods. They have a country the size of Illinois that now has 104 million, and that in the next 20 years that will go to 342 million before leveling off. We all know that China has 1.2 billion people, and despite all of their efforts to curb it, that number is going up. In Nigeria, the largest nation in Africa, they now have 100 million people or more, and that will go to 529 million before going down. Will we have millions of refugees? Will there be thousands of people migrating for food? What are we going to do about this problem? Or shall we just drift on and say, well, somehow it's going to be solved? It's not being solved, and it's not getting better. And in fact, it's getting worse, and it's aggravated now by this new phenomenon of the last 5 years, namely the enormous debt of the Third World. The Third World now owes $900 billion. Of that, $380 billion is owed by Latin America, mostly to North American lending entities. And under the Baker Plan and other plans, this is going to be marked down or written off. But that's not going to cause the people of the Philippines to be less in anguish. They have to get up $2 billion every year just to service this debt. Well, as Americans, are they asleep or they don't want to hear? I look back at my lifetime in America, and we love to remember the moments of generosity, such as the Marshall Plan, the Peace Corps, the beginning of foreign aid, the creation of the United Nations, and yet we turn around and we look at the terrible things that have happened in the United States. There's a black mood of selfishness there now. I haven't seen that in my lifetime up until the last few years. We have the yuppies and the me generation. I'm ashamed that the United States ranks only 15th out of the 17 nations that do in fact give aid to the Third World. The United States now, to complicate the whole thing, has become a debtor nation because of its own crassness, by reason of the fact that it increased its external debt, or rather its total deficit, from $900 billion to $2.7 trillion. And I'm not happy about this at all. And when I like to think that the Catholic bishops are having an impact, I have a second thought and say, well, I'm not really certain that this country in which I live does have a conscience in all of this matter. For example, the United States has not ratified the major treaties that have emerged from the United Nations. Canada and the UK have done that almost routinely. Yet the United States has ratified only 6 of the least important of the 22 covenants or treaties that have emerged from the United Nations over the last 30 or 40 years. The United States has never ratified the economic rights, and yet the right to food is an essential part of international law. It is now guaranteed by customary international law as a right entitled to which all people are entitled. The United States Congress has made nice noises that the right to food should be attainable. And the tragedy is that for the first time in the history of the world, we could feed every living human being. That was not possible until the Green Revolution, but it is possible now. And the fact that millions of children are dying in Ethiopia of starvation it has to be attributed to the wealthy nations. We can't say that it's beyond our control. The wealthy nations did try. After the beginning of the United Nations, it established the World Health Organization and FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. And I remember vividly the World Food Conference in 1974 coming together, and many members of the United States Congress put pressure on President Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to make a pledge that we would do all that we could in the United States to phase out poverty. And under enormous pressure, Dr. Kissinger said that within a decade, no child will go to bed hungry. And that was a false promise, and they never intended to keep it. And now more children go to bed hungry than in 1974, when the richest nation in the history of the world made this pledge that no child will go to bed hungry after 10 years. The universal vaccination that UNICEF works for is possible with just a few $1 million. It would be attainable. And that children would not be getting polio as they are now in the Third World. 500,000 children every single year get polio simply because they have not had the vaccine. Universal literacy is possible, and the dream and the plan of UNESCO is there. All we need is somehow the will to do it. Yes, fewer people have been dying in some countries of hunger in the last generation. 50% of the hungry now live in just 5 countries: India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Indonesia. And we hear every time that the General Assembly comes together at the UN, the demand for the new international economic order. That is an assertion by the free world, by the third world. They want the final repudiation of colonialism. And yes, some of the more extreme there, or the more righteous, want damages for the despoliation of their natural resources by the colonial powers. And we look out and see all of the people who tonight are homeless. I commend to you a beautiful and an extraordinary document that came from the Vatican 6 months ago about the homeless. And the Commission on Justice and Peace associated with the Holy See made a survey around the world, and they discovered that 1 billion human beings are quite literally homeless. And thousands of them have no home at all. They just live in the streets. And that it made a plea to the world saying if there is anything that a person needs for his or her basic dignity, it is a home. And it had the theology of the home, that families can grow only if they have adequate homes. And it made this beautiful plea for the world to do something about homeless. And that in the United States we are humiliated beyond description by the fact that we have maybe 2 or 3 million literally homeless people who live in the streets. And this number has gone up for a wide variety of reasons. And that near Georgetown Law School there is a home for 800 men who are homeless. And I walk or drive by there every day. And I must say it stabs me that in this wealthy nation, why is this allowed to happen? Catholics are active, but think of the power that we would have if we were really committed Christians. And yes, if the Catholic bishops would say we're going to put out pastorals, but we're going to insist that our government do something about this. Once again, the Catholic bishops have been almost radicals over the last 8 years, testifying and making statements deploring the homeless and the slashing back of funds for housing and all of the dreadful things that have been done to the poor and the young and the innocent over the last several years. And so that we look out at the world tonight and we try to assess, is America a good country or is it a group of barbarians? We are now, God forgive us, exporting cigarettes to the third world because the sale has gone down in the United States. And now the tobacco companies are getting millions of people hooked on cigarettes in the Philippines and Taiwan and China. And yes, they're advertising those over there because they lobbied to get the law changed. And on the conscience of these people, and yes, of all of America, because it could be prevented, is the new sin of causing cancer to millions of people in the third world. And the Congress, with one single law, could just stop the exportation of cigarettes to the third world. Can we therefore have a happy ending to this melancholy scene? I'm telling you, I'm breaking it as I see it in my soul. The wonderful things that the church has done, the leadership of the Catholic bishops, and yet you have here almost an immoral nation in doing so many dreadful things. Well, let me talk about what's going to happen. And one scenario that comes to my mind when I'm particularly depressed is this, that maybe in 50 or 100 years, things will come out much better than we think tonight. Maybe nuclear weapons will not have been used, and maybe that the superpowers will come to an agreement to phase those things out. And they will look back at the coexistence of terror as a terrible time. Maybe the United States will come to its knees and say, you may not threaten to do that which you may not morally do. And the threat to the United States to the other side is in and of itself a sin, because we can't carry out that which we threaten to do. Maybe we'll come and understand, and maybe we'll say that our national security, that great vaunted thing, means not that we terrorize people, but that we give food and literacy to all around the world. Maybe 50 or 100 years from now, let's imagine and hope and pray tonight, all of those things have gone and we have a relatively peaceful universe. And the historians will look back and say, how did this ever happen? And I think it's not fanciful to say that the historians will say there was a religious conversion in the United States beginning in the 70s and in the 80s, and the Catholic bishops, for 1/4 of the nation, put forth pastorals. They educated. The Protestants joined. The Jews said the same thing, and that you have a conversion of a nation. Wouldn't it be magnificent for the church if people could look back 50 or 100 years from now and say, yes, it was the Catholic bishops that started all of these things. They went deep into Catholic and Christian tradition and said, no moral principle can possibly justify what the United States has done ever since it bombed Hiroshima, building up these hideous weapons with the triad threatening extinction from the other side with massive retaliation as the penalty. How in the name of anybody's morality can that be justified? And that's what the bishop said in very sophisticated, nuanced way. And so I like to think that over the past 10 or so years, the Catholics in America, with this improved leadership, have changed things, and that we have had a long history. Now we are struggling to find our identity. But I like to think that the Catholic Church all over the earth is going to do something comparable to what I just suggested, a resurrection of basic morality. The Catholic Church has done things like this in the past. We forget our glorious history, and it was the Catholic Church that brought the world out of the Dark Ages. It was the Catholic Church that established the first universities at Oxford and Bologna and Paris and elsewhere. And it was the Catholic Church that really established the hospitals, and that the Catholic Church gave an enormous impetus to secular learning. And that's what Arnold Toynbee says in many ways in all of his books, and that in other cultures that relied upon Buddhism and Hinduism, they didn't have the drive for learning and intellectual curiosity or the aptitude to cure the sick that the Catholic Church has had. And today the Catholic Church is looking at another period, let's call it the Dark Ages. And can the Catholic Church, by education and by prayer and by inspiration, say that the entire Catholic world has to change? So the lesson is that as Catholics we have to continue to be Christians in the fullest sense. We have to teach and love. We have to cooperate with all Christians and with believers and non-believers. We have to announce the gospel from the housetops and the gospel in all of its implications. And those implications say that it is immoral to threaten destruction to those people who morally we cannot and will not destroy. And that the gospel proclaims that silence in the face of global starvation becomes at a moment in time complicity in evil. And basic morality says that the defense of a nation in the name of this selfish nation cannot be carried out when you are threatening to do those things that can't be morally justified by any objective. And that is precisely what George Kennan said recently, one of the first ambassadors to the Soviet Union, the man that apparently invented the term containment of communism. And he said boldly when he accepted the Einstein Award that no objective, moral or political or social, no objective that you can possibly conceive of can ever justify the use of even one nuclear weapon. And the time has come to love each other lest we perish. Last week, I was very thrilled at the statement made by the Social Affairs Committee of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. It said it all very well. It has said this: it is time to make visible our commitment to be peacemakers. It is time for us to make hard choices about the arms race and the Canadian defense policy. And they applaud the Nobel Peace Prize going for the first time to the UN peacekeeping forces. And the Canadian bishop said just last week that the Christian vision can transform the political order. And they said that the world today is rooted, as Pope John Paul II said some time ago, the world is rooted in the structures of sin. It repeats the fact that you know so well, that Canada is caught between the superpowers, and the Catholic bishops reiterate their position that Canadian soil should not be available for attacking one of these superpowers. And the statement calls for a recall to basic, fundamental, moral, and ethical concepts and commitments. And finally, the bishops call for arms policies that reverse the arms race and move Canada into a leadership in pursuing peace with justice. So, my dear friends, it all comes back to what your bishop said a week or two ago. It comes back to the primordial meaning of Christianity, namely that everyone is our brother and sister, and that when we even think of allowing harm to happen to all of these people, we do more than harming them. We harm our Lord himself. It mattered to God, and in the Garden of Eden, or rather in the Garden of the Gethsemane, when our Lord actually had that physical blood flow from him, he foresaw all the sins of the world. He saw this age. He saw the savageness of America, and that every time we forgot love, every time we threatened retaliation, every time we wanted vengeance, that he suffered more. All of these children around the world who suffer, therefore, are our brothers and sisters, and they are just as precious to our Lord as we are to him. Think of the tenderness that we have for a child, and it is unthinkable, is it not, that we would ever hurt a child. And we see all the time when we travel or in families that everyone seeks to alleviate any complaint of a child. We alter the pattern of our lives to help this little child. We have instincts that are almost irreversible, that we want to help and love this little child. Well, can't we say that of all God's children? And that those children are out there. And that's what I think of all of the time when I write for or teach or talk to some of the 54 million American Catholics. I wait with expectation what they could do, the potential that they have, and I know that they understand it. And yet we look at the Catholic Church in America, and it is the best of times and it is the worst of times. And that these people will be making history whether they want to or not, and they will be making it for better or for worse. And as a result, I would ask your prayers for the American church and for their leaders and for the future path that this church will take. And that future path, I must say, is really quite uncertain in my mind. And that I don't know what kind of leadership will happen, how they will follow, what's going to happen. Could the Catholic Church in America, despite all of these powerful structures, could it wither away to a devout handful with little significant influence over the future policies of the country? Some people are angry at the church now for taking these aggressive positions. Could they isolate the church more? Could they condemn people or sour people in the church? I don't know, my dear friends. I'm just speculating. I like to think that the church is going to go on from victory to victory to a position of moral strength, to a position where it can change the future of the world. And that I'm not exaggerating, I don't think, the power of American Catholics. Here you have this powerful, arrogant, self-righteous, immoral nation, and yet you have every fourth person there living in the Catholic tradition. Think of the power that they could have over American policies if they studied and prayed and really understood and believed what the Catholic bishops were saying. So I hope and pray and try to educate them every single day, because in the providence of God, they are given a position never before given really in modern times or any times to a minority in a country with all of the faults and yet the potential of the United States. So I say to you finally, before your comments and questions, that it comes back to how are we going to love? Are we really going to understand our religion and sacrifice and understand what it means? Let me close with a statement by Pope John the 23rd, who summed it all up. Years ago, there was a group that came to Rome, and they wanted to see the Holy Father, and he wasn't scheduled to see them, and he came spontaneously and said, I'll just say a few words. And that wonderful man, Pope John the 23rd, said this in 1962. He just looked out at these people and spoke briefly and greeted them, and he said, let me just tell you that the future of the world belongs to those who love. Thank you very much. Take the questions. Let me thank Dr. Michael Higgins, who kindly invited me here, and let me also thank and congratulate Robert Donaldson. He is doing very important work, as you know, in the development fund of your distinguished university, and that I congratulate both of them on the very fine series they've had, and that I am pleased to participate. Let's have some better jokes than I told. Yes?
No joke. It seems from my experience that the hand of the church writes these encyclicals and pastoral letters with one hand, and then the other hand of the church buries them on the back shelf somewhere. In my 30-some years of going to listen to Sunday sermons, it's only 6 months ago, for the first time, that I ever heard any reference to a pastoral letter or an encyclical. And I guess the statement that I'm making is that it's not so much a question of the vision or the development in terms of the encyclicals, but that there's no implementation.
All right, let me talk to that. And the bishops of the United States were very conscious of that. And the last section of the pastoral on peace brings up this precisely. And they said that we have done our bit, the Catholic bishops. We're going to continue to do this. But in the nature of things, this is a church made up of lay people. They want intense education in Catholic schools, in Catholic parishes. They wanted a special program to implement this thing. So the bishops have laid out a program. Now, there's plenty of fault to go around, the silence and all that, but let's pick on the lay people for a moment. And that, wait, I mean, in the United States, there's so many of them. And that, we had a special thing for the 1 million people who graduated from Jesuit colleges. And we said, now here's the encyclical, the pastoral, this is an ideal occasion. And that we went around and made whoopee. And I recall vividly talking to 1,200 Jesuit alumni at Gonzaga High School in Washington. And I told them what to do, and that they have to know this thing. So that I frankly was disappointed that after 6 months nothing had happened. And they say, well, you got to talk to us, and you got to study, and all. Very sophisticated people. So that, sure, everybody has dropped the ball, and that it's too bad. But I don't think everything is lost. Now, how can they have phase 2 after 5 years? Well, that's what the Catholic bishops are thinking about now. But the Catholic bishops are saying, listen, we knocked ourselves out, and that we had these committees and subcommittees, and we came together specially to ratify this thing. We took a lot of heat. Where is the church? We've given this to the church. We're not going to go around saying, here's chapters, all of these things. What has happened? So they're dumping on the Catholic colleges. Now, what are you doing about it? And Catholic colleges are pretty good. They'll have a course or something. So that I think that they've tried to do what they can, but that let's just not jump on the clerics, and that let's just talk about the lay people for a moment. That I have very well-educated Catholic lay people in my own family and my own friends, and that I fault them. And they're so anxious to make money and be yuppies and get their kids into the best schools and get to the golf club course. I mean, what are they doing for the church? So that I can fault all of them. And there is this terrible immorality of silence in America. Oh, somehow the government's going to take care of it. And I say, listen, you have to know about SALT I and SALT II and the ABM Treaty and STI. Their eyes glaze over. So they have to study a little on that thing. So that I just think that it's a failure of commitment or something. Now, it's lamentable, and I don't fully understand it, but these people, highly educated Catholics in America, and they're my best friends, that they are very up on cholesterol and anything that means something to them. And yet you talk about something that is essential as what I tried to bring out in my talk, and they're not that interested. Well, as I say, we can dump on the Catholic priests and the parish and the seminaries, but that what are we doing with these Catholic lay people? And that are they pagans? Deep down, are they pagans? They don't care about this. And that some of them are so self-righteous, they'll be chewing out the pastor for not doing something or other, and yet they are not doing anything themselves. And that, as I said, 51% of them voted for George Bush, and that, to be personal, I worked very hard for Mike Dukakis, and they assigned me, they sent me to a lot of Catholic places, and I zeroed in. I said, how can you vote for a man who is just totally in opposition to everything that the Catholic bishops are saying? Well, once in a while I got to vote, but I don't know. Yes?
One last point. The Ministry of Education in this province spent a lot of money developing curriculum for years.
Uh-huh.
And they found out that it all sat on the shelf, just like these encyclicals have sat on the shelf. And the question is not blaming the pastor or anybody else. I wasn't suggesting that. But it becomes just as sophisticated and just as difficult a process to figure out the implementation.
All right, good.
And I think it might be helpful just to throw the ball back for one brief moment, that would be, I think, wise for the bishops to develop the next phase to try to examine how it is that people do learn and respond and react to these questions, and design facilitative processes for parishes, for lay people, whatever, because it's too much of a leap to say, go kind of nowhere to the nuclear bomb and the economy, and people just...
Well, all right, now, they're doing, in my country, they're doing that at the U.S. Catholic Conference, and they've hired several people to do precisely that. at every single level. And in the nature of things, you're not going to get these people if somehow the White House is saying everything is in order and that, Gorbachev, we got him in control and all that. It's very complicated, and it's difficult for anybody to take on their country, and that's what the bishops have asked the Catholics to do. You say to your country you are totally opposed to some of the basic fundamentals of our foreign policy. Well, the bishops haven't done this before. Now, maybe they could come back and keep insisting. Because I see another hand. I hear a joke. Way back, yes.
The quote that you gave from the Canadian bishop about Canada being situated between the two superpowers. How would you view Canada leaving NATO or NORAD, for example, and what possible repercussions that would have for American policy?
Well, sir, I'm not ducking that. All I know is what I read, and I quoted from the Catholic New Times for November 20. And the Canadian bishops repeat call for disarmament. And that I quoted from this. So I'm not in a position, as not a Canadian, to take, all I know is that it's probably a hard question. I would assume that there's some disagreement about it. But that I would hope that the wonderful people who have taken a night to listen to this would take leadership. Now, how does one take leadership? It comes in different packages at different levels. And I think the teacher in a high school can take leadership and get people involved in this thing. And that I bother myself, how do I take leadership? I teach a course on arms control at Georgetown Law School, and for the students, it's clearly a revelation. And that's what it's supposed to be. And they write papers and so on, and I like to think that they're converted. But we have to preach this in season and out of season. Now, the 12 Catholic bishops of Texas, of all places, 3 or 4 years ago, did something very unusual. All 3 of them signed a statement saying that no Catholic in Texas or elsewhere could work in a factory that makes parts for nuclear weapons, and that we don't have any evidence that even one person disassociated himself. But I must say that was very instructional in Texas and elsewhere. And those bishops took a lot of heat, and that they made a carefully reasoned statement that to participate would be formal and material cooperation, and that it's wrong. Well, Archbishop Wundhausen has been very gutsy on this, and that the people of his diocese probably had something to do with all the troubles that man had, and he's now fully reinstated. But that would that we had some more courageous bishops. Now, many bishops are not ones to get headlines, but they're as troubled as this gentleman is that they're not doing anything, or they're not doing anything effectively. And I spoke with a Catholic bishop the other day, and that he knew that I was involved in this and had written a book about this, and that he said, what do we do next? And that I said, Bishop, I wish I could give you A, B, C, D. But I said, you have to go and keep agitating this thing at the diocesan level and at a parish level. And I said, why don't you go and ask the people what you should be doing or they should be doing? Why don't you call a special meeting and maybe 500 from the diocese would come and say, I want to find out what you are doing, what I should be doing. He said, well, maybe that's a good idea. But that bishops are busy people, and that the moment they get into this thing, the right wing says you're intervening in politics, blah, blah, blah. And so it's a torment. And then there's other problems too, more domestic problems, and that you can organize people for a hunger march, and the bishop can go on the hunger march and raise a few bucks, and that is much less controversial and isn't equally profitable. So it's a hard thing, and we want to, frankly, forget about this because it's very, very complicated area. And that I hope that the church doesn't let us forget about it. Now, frankly, a lot of people are disappointed that Pope John Paul II doesn't say more about this. He was very wonderful when he went to Hiroshima, and also when he went to Auschwitz. He said some of the right things. But if we had a constant stream of reminders from Rome, it would be enormously helpful. And that we certainly get constant reminders about all of the orthodoxy and dogma. And that if one little insignificant priest in California writes a crazy little book, Cardinal Ratzinger is dumping all over him. Well, if we had the same energy to say that we in the Catholic Church are going to get rid of nuclear weapons in this world, then we'd be a peace church. Maybe some people could stimulate the Pope to do that. And that if
if the bishops thought that there was millions of people in the pews who are yearning for this leadership, they'd be much more anxious to do it. And one of the sad things about the 5 years since the pastoral came out on the nukes is this, that the right wing screams and the wanderer emotes and you get all. But where are the peace people? Why aren't millions of people saying to the bishop, bravo, do it again, we love this, and that this is what you should be doing? They don't get many letters saying that, and they get hate letters, and they're saying that they're soft on communism and all of that. So all I can say is that this is supposed to be the age of the laity, and speaking of my country, there's 54 million people out there, and that I just hope somehow that there's a conversion for them. Yes, sir.
Drinan, as a former congressman, what are your thoughts on the deficit financing in the state, particularly when so many major economists in the state point to the great natural resources of the USA? And the second question, what are your thoughts on the Vatican deficit this year?
All right. Well, let's take the Vatican deficit first. We'll go back to the other. The Vatican deficit is only like 57 million. We can understand that. And that if you raise enough money or you fire a few people, 57 million, you can make that go away. But that I can't fully understand what has happened to the United States in the last 8 years. I just can't. And that when I was in Congress for 10 years, we always try to get economy votes, and we raise taxes, and you try to balance the budget. But that it wasn't it didn't come in a balance for many, many reasons. One of them was that the price of energy went up. It was quintuple because of Ayatollah and OPEC, and that caused the federal government to spend much more, especially for the military. In any event, in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was leaving office, the total debt of the country was $900 billion. And now, Mr. Reagan, after 8 years, has added more to that deficit than all previous presidents put together from George Washington on. And now it's 2.7 trillion. I don't understand that. I mean, that's 1,000 billion. And that the interest alone on that is 160 billion a year. That means that every 16 cents that's taken in of every dollar, that goes just to the interest, just off to the banks. Well, how can we do this? Well, I think that you can cut back severely on the military, and that we have 2.1 million men under arms, and if you cut that off by like 500,000, no one would miss them, and that if you get rid of all of the waste and the duplication. I read this the other day, unbelievable. There are more lieutenant colonels than lieutenants. You got to say that again to understand it. There's more lieutenant colonels than lieutenants. So you have this grade creep, and that I hope that they put the heat on George Bush, and that if he is determined not to raise taxes, okay, let him cut a few billion out of the military. It'd be very easy to do. So there's ways of doing it. However, I'm afraid, frankly, they're going to cut back on services to the poor, and that's what they said yesterday. As a matter of fact, they're going to cut out 5 to 7 billion in Medicare. Maybe there's some, not waste, there's some bloated bills in Medicare, but I don't want the poor and the elderly to have inadequate medical care just to balance that budget. Now, you say all of the vast resources of the United States, could we somehow just drift along and it's going to take care of itself? I don't hear economists saying that at all. Well, what are these vast resources? I suppose they could sell the Statue of Liberty or something like that, or they could sell a lot of land. The United States government still owns roughly 1/4 of all the land mass in the United States. Unbelievable. Well, what are you going to sell mountains in Montana for? I don't know. I suppose we should begin to consider things like that. But I think you have to be responsible, and I think that it was reckless and irresponsible of Mr. Bush to say no taxes. And that's wrong, and it's misleading people. And that's one more lie that he had in his campaign. And it was a campaign of lies and vilification and calumny, and that's how he got to the White House. Probably the only reason he got to the White House. It was a very close election, 53-47. And I think people are going to remember that. And I must say, I am still shocked that George Bush did that. And that he took the sleazy advice of all those people around him, and he used racism. And I said this in the National Catholic Reporter last week, that he used Willie Horton, a black man who committed a rape, and that imputing these being soft on crime to Governor Dukakis. So I think I'm ashamed of the election, and it's one of the most vicious that I've seen.
and that it was unworthy of a presidential candidate. I know Governor Dukakis well. He was the treasurer of my campaign for a long time, and I represented him in Congress for 10 years in Brookline, Mass. And that I know at the beginning he was very reluctant to answer these clearly malicious and false statements, and that he wasn't going to dignify the Pledge of Allegiance. He's just as patriotic as anybody else. And that his top advisors knew that if he answered one of these sleazy things, George Bush would have another one the very next day. And they wanted to drag him in, so all he did was answering the sleaze and not getting out his own message. Rightly or wrongly, they decided for at least 3 weeks, we're going to get our own message out. And it was a good, coherent message of responsible tactics that he was going to use when he was president. So I'm just disappointed that this party should do this, and that George Bush would acquiesce in getting down into the gutter. And that he had other terrible things. I happen to be a vice chairman of the advisory committee of the American Civil Liberties Union, and that I disagree with some of their objectives. But for him to come out and say that he disagrees and to impute that this is subversive and unpatriotic is a vicious, malicious thing to do. And the President of the United States has said those things, and I remember, and millions of people remember, and I think it's a very bad thing. And the Congress of the United States really doesn't have any respect for George Bush. It was overwhelmingly Democrat. He didn't get a single thing. He had not a single coattail. All of the majority of the governors and the majority of the state legislatures are Democrat. It says something, and it shows that by this vilification, by this sleaze, unknown in American politics, really, presidential politics, that he took the White House. Yes.
Just move to one other subject, Are the problems of the inner city parishes in Detroit, Michigan, symptomatic of other large urban areas in the United States?
Oh, I'm afraid that they are, and maybe they could be handled more adroitly by other people. But no, I think that in Chicago you have many parishes that are now black ghettos that are economically very troubling. I don't know what really could be done overall, but that in Boston, where I lived for many years, you don't have the large number of black people, but you have probably 150,000, and that there are some black parishes there that are struggling. And I think that some priests have been very heroic. They've wanted to go there and build it up. And that I have relatives who go from the suburbs with food and clothing and so on to these parishes, and they help them. But once again, that it's easy to dump on a diocese. What are the Catholics doing in the suburbs? And we all know these wonderful, well-educated Catholics who have benefited by Catholic education, who are very devout, and yet have they heard about the poor? Do they really work at the poor? Maybe they'll give something to St. Vincent de Paul, but in another generation, Catholics work directly with the poor, and I don't see them doing that now. And that I would hope that they would do it and give their children an inspiration. I know whenever I see Catholics going out, reaching out to the poor, I'm very impressed. There's a student who does research for me at Georgetown Law School, and that I learned just by accident the other day that every week he goes from 6 at night to 12 to homeless men and feeds them and talks with them, and he does this for nothing. I was just overwhelmed that he should be doing this. And that I asked him, and he didn't tell me, someone told me. I said, do you enjoy that? He said, my mother has always done that, and I do it. See the transmission of a generation. So these millions of Catholics who have had all these benefits, they could return them. And that in America, very few of the blacks are Catholics. Of the 28 million blacks, maybe 3% are Catholic. It's a handful. And that think of what they would think of our church if, in fact, they saw Catholics in significant numbers unobtrusively going and helping these people. Or if they saw Catholic lawyers saying, we want open housing, we want to have a good, fair housing law, all of those things. And that, speaking as a Democrat, we have a burden, apparently, that the Democrats have found home in the blacks have found home in the Democratic Party. And that of the 28 million blacks in America, 91% voted for Dukakis. They are not going to vote Republican. They think that the Republicans, quite understandably and quite rightly, that the Republicans have opposed civil rights legislation at every turn, and they have, for the most part. And that in the Reagan administration, they set aside affirmative actions and goals and targets in the EEOC and so on. And the blacks remember that. And that the Republicans point to this, and quietly they say that, well, we have nothing to do with the blacks. All those blacks go to the Democrats, and the Democrats are pushing the blacks. And that's why Governor Dukakis got only 41% of the white vote. And that's a serious blow, when 86% of all the voters are white. Well, I just say that, I shouldn't say it's a burden of the Democrats, but that think of what would happen if the white Christians of America said, we're going to solve this racial problem, and we're ashamed of slavery and separate but equal and all the terrible things that have been inflicted on the black. My God, it would be a new country. And racism, one of the core problems, would go away. And that the Catholic bishops have been very strong in this area in the United States, and that some people say, well, why don't they turn up with a pastoral on race? They may, but they don't have to. They have said bold and gutsy things from a way back. They were for the Civil Rights Act in '64 and the Voting Rights Act in '65 and the Fair Housing Bill in '68, and they were the prime mover in updating the Fair Housing Bill that passed just last year in the U.S. Congress, and they've had a very good record of going to the blacks. 12 Catholic bishops are black now in the United States, and that there's a significant number of Catholic parishes that are black, and they want to integrate them, so that I think that that's a very serious problem. In Canada, you have a much more civilized approach. You have no black problem. You've never had slavery, and that we in the United States have this terrible burden of trying to undo what our Christian forebears did. And every time I read or think about it, I am appalled at what happened in America. And it is simply beyond me that in 1619, good people who left England so that they could be better Christians, they brought slaves to Jamestown in Virginia and bought slaves as if they were bales of cotton. And by the time of the Revolution, there were 700,000 slaves in America, and the U.S. Constitution said nothing about slavery except to perpetuate it quietly without mentioning slavery or blacks. In 7 different ways, the 55 founding fathers perpetuated slavery, and it existed until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. And after that, the Supreme Court nullified congressional legislation, and they said that Jim Crow was all right, separate but equal, and that the slaves were kept in bondage until 1954. And we look back at all of that dreadful thing where the churches really acquiesced in this, where we had black churches, and that how could the blacks forgive us or forget this? So it seems to me that's on our soul, and that once again, the Catholics, it seems to me, have a supreme opportunity to do something. Well, once again, the Catholic bishops have done all that they can. And do I see racism among Catholics? It's terrible. It is just absolutely terrible. At Georgetown Law School, we have 18% black students, which is the highest of the blacks in any law school in the country. And I feel racism by white students. Some of them are Catholic. And it's there. And how can you just cut this thing out? It's going to take some time. You have to elevate the blacks and give them more opportunities. But once again, the Catholic Church, all of us have to say we can, in fact, eradicate and eliminate racism. Yes?
I'd like to get back to the theme that you started with this evening, in that to ask you, Father, will I see women priests or married priests? I like Christ.
It was just a joke. No, I don't have the crystal ball here. I'm just a simple country lawyer and a little priest. But that, will we have married priests? Last year I gave the Darcy lectures at Oxford University, and during my weeks there, this was discussed constantly, because there is a married priest who used to be an Anglican priest who is now the deputy chaplain in Oxford University. Very fine man. And he's about the only Catholic priest, or one of the few Catholic priests who are married, who used to be Anglican priests. I don't pretend to understand the whole English situation, but it's very complicated because if this happens, there'll be some resentment and resistance by Catholics, and there'll also be some resistance by Anglicans. And a few, not all, said that we now have these ecumenical conversations going. We don't want them to be deterred or soured by this whole question of can Anglicans become Catholic priests and remain married. So it's a little complicated. On women priests, as far as I could see, that this administration in Rome is not going to yield on that at all. Is there any compromise they can become deaconesses? I just don't know. I think that they're kind of locked in on that. But I don't think, frankly, that women who are concerned about equality, I don't think that's their prime consideration. They understand the centuries of tradition and so on. But I think we have to start on being honest in our conscience about women. And are we sexist deep down? Just the other day in my class in International Human Rights at Georgetown, we had a long discussion about CEDWA, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And we had two women and 2 men explain this, document the history and so on, and that one woman was particularly militant
And one man was surprisingly chauvinist, and that he, in essence, said, these women are pushing too hard. Just let them wait and they'll get all these things. And women were very offended by that. And frankly, I was a little surprised that at this level, people who are enormously educated, 25 years old, seniors at Georgetown Law School, that they had traces of racism, or rather sexism. And that it really hit me again that this is very, very deep and profound. But what should the Catholic Church do? We should listen and pray and talk with these people. There's going to be, I think, a reaction against the superwoman. That some of these women said, I can be an MD and a psychiatrist and have 3 kids, et cetera, et cetera. And I think some women are backing away and say that, I don't want to do that. I'm not certain how these kids will turn out. And that, what do they want? Well, this is the old question of the male chauvinist. What do they want? Why can't they be like us? And that's not a very responsive answer. All I know is that I'm troubled, and I learn every day about the aspirations of women. And what pains me particularly is that there's hardly a single young woman in America entering a religious order. And that we've had distinguished nuns who ran colleges, the Mothers of the Sacred Heart. We had thousands of them, and that they were highly regarded in the community, and now no one aspires to that. Well, is it just the structures of that organization that are too rigid? I know a young woman whose father teaches with me at Georgetown Law School. And 2 years ago, to the astonishment and really the delight of the parents, she said that I am going to join the novitiate of the Mothers of the Sacred Heart. She had them in high school. She had her MA, almost a PhD in a specialty. She joined the novitiate, and everybody was jubilant, and that after 18 months she left. And the parents don't say much about it, but they're very, very crushed. And that the woman said, apparently, there's no future there. And that there's no future in the church, and that the order is small. And I don't want to end up like teaching in a high school somewhere. So we have to rethink this whole thing. The future of the church rides to some extent on women, on the place of women, and giving them dignity. Now, if that woman, with all her talents, thought, well, they might send me to get a degree in canon law, I might be a chancellor sometime, or I could teach at a seminary, there'd be attraction there. But she sees no way, apparently, by which she could use her multiple talents in this particular order. Yes?
Brother Drinan, would you leave politics voluntarily? The reason I ask is because here in Canada, our Catholic hierarchy asked one of our priests who was a member of Parliament to leave.
No, it wasn't voluntary. It was one man, one vote, and Pope John Paul had the one vote. No, sir, thank you for the question, that they changed canon law, and that no priest or nun now may hold any governmental position that has civil power, whether the power is executive, legislative, or judicial. And I talked to Father Ogle on the phone on more than one occasion, and as you may know, he's quite sick now. Say a prayer for him, and that he served the country and the Parliament well. There was another priest in the legislature of Colorado who had to leave. There were some nuns that left their order, and one nun is still in the state legislature in Rhode Island, where she does a wonderful job. I assume that the policy reason was this, that a priest is a sacral figure, and he should not be a governmental functionary. I would have hoped that they would allow this to be settled at the regional level, as it was under the old canon law. And under the old canon law, Canon 139 wasn't exactly encouraging to priests, but it did allow a priest to run if he had the local permission, which I had of the late Cardinal Cushing and of my provincial. But it is I suppose, a debatable subject, and that one nice man said to me, he enjoyed having me as my congressman, but he said, I have to admit that there's probably more important things for a priest to do than to be a politician. Well, thank you, sir. So that's my little story. There was a priest in the Dutch Parliament, and when he got the word from Rome that he can't do this anymore, he left the priesthood, then he lost the election. So I assume that somebody in Rome was saying, ah, ha, ha. Yes?
Father Drinan, you were talking about capitalism and the American way of life.
Yes.
And, you talked about Congress could pass a law to stop the tobacco manufacturers from exporting cancer.
That's right.
To what extent does big business in the United States control domestic and foreign policy?
Well, I'm not certain that they control it. They certainly influence a lot. And on the tobacco thing, how could they stop it? They could just simply say that this is an addicting subject, a very, very dangerous thing, and that we refuse to allow you to export it. We deny you an export license. Why don't they do that for domestic cigarettes? Well, they should, in my judgment. I think it's a carcinogen per se, and that 1,000 people a day die from cigarettes in the United States. 1,000 people a day. 350,000 a year. Unbelievable. And we allow it to go on. And the Tobacco Institute is vicious in their representations. Well, I won't say they control it, but certainly the defense lobby has an enormous amount of whammo. You remember Ike Eisenhower in his last days as president. He understood what had transpired in his time as president, and he talked about the military-industrial empire or complex, and that they certainly can influence. The United States spends $300 billion a year on the military, and the contractors, all of them, have a significant influence. They have a more insidious influence now in the last 8 years than before because we have political action committees. And I think that's the cancer of American political life. This means that a corporation like General Motors can ask its top echelon and its stockholders to give money. They take hundreds of thousands of dollars and give some to Republicans and some to Democrats, mostly to incumbents, because especially those incumbents that do their will. And that I think it's a sort of an insidious practice. Now, I'm not dumping all over capitalism. Capitalism is really quite creative, and the Catholic Church has never been opposed to capitalism as such. A regulated capitalism where society takes care of the last and the lowest and the least and the weak people. So will big business always have an influence? Yeah, do they have the same influence in England? To some extent, but that it can be a very bad influence in America. On the other hand, there are very good public interest lobbies, pro-consumer lobbies, a lobby for the consumer interest, and that they don't have the money that the PACs of big. So you ask a good question, and it is very, very troubling. And that's one of the things, the PACs, that I didn't quite have to face up to in Congress, that I had no opposition in 1980 and then 1978, and then I didn't run in 1980, and the PACs have come on strong since that time. And there's a few members of the Congress that do not take money from political action committees. They're brave people, and that maybe they'll get defeated sometime. Common Cause, which is a citizens lobby, is very, very strong against the PACs. And the Congress in 1978 almost passed a situation by which the PACs would be phased out and there'd be governmental assistance on a matching basis for members of Congress that were running for office. They would duplicate the system that we now have and that has worked very well at the presidential level.